Matthew 5:27 to 32. What does Jesus think about sex, marriage, and divorce? Now, we all know what the TV thinks about it. We all know what the schools think about it. And we all know what the council thinks about it. So we're not going to bother with any of that. Instead, we're going to find out, what does Jesus think about it? Jesus is the Son of God. What does Jesus think, the Son of God who actually created marriage and actually invented sex? So what does God think about it? He'd be the best person to find out what he thinks. So we're going to see what God thinks about marriage. We're going to see what he thinks about lust and see what he thinks about divorce. Now, if you remember last week and the week before, we looked at God's moral law. And we were talking about the 10 Commandments that God gave us. Anyone know what number 7 is of the 10 Commandments? Thou shalt not commit adultery. That's right. Okay, good. Now, that's kind of an easy one, isn't it? You probably could have all guessed that if you even didn't know that. Now, if you remember, Jesus is correcting everyone's mindset because people have been taught by who? Pharisees and the scribes. And the Pharisees and the scribes told them, yeah, this is how you really approach the law. And they were doing it in a way that's called legalistic. It's called legalism. Now, something that really bugs me about legalism is that most Christians don't know what it means. You know, when I say to someone offers me some software that hasn't been paid for, and I say, thanks, mate, but I really like to buy software. That's the right thing to do. They say, you're being legalistic. That is completely misunderstanding what legalism is, okay? So we're going to have a look at legalism, right? Legalism draws a line, says this is the thing we're not allowed to do, and then it sees how close can we get to that line. Okay, that's legalism. Legalism says, the law says, you shall not commit adultery. Let's see how close we can get to that line without actually committing adultery. Does everyone get that? Yeah. Okay. Legalism is not being good. Legalism isn't someone who's like, I really want to follow God's law. Legalism is, I really want to break God's law. How can I get as close to it technically without actually breaking the law? Here's an example. You might have had this when you was a kid. Say your mum, you ask your mum, can I go to the cinema with Andy? And your mum says, no, you can't. So what you do later is you go with your mate Chris to the cinema. Your mum says later, how comes you went to the cinema? Well, you said I couldn't go with Andy. So I thought if I went with Chris, it would be okay. Now that is legalism, okay? Because you're saying, where is the line? Okay, the line must be going to the cinema with Andy. Therefore, if I go with Chris, I'm not really breaking the law, which we all know obviously is wrong. So, this is legalism. Now, this is what you really should do. You should find out what is offensive to God and stay as far away from it as possible. Do you all get that? So, as we approach the commandments that Jesus is explaining to us, we're not looking at it as, okay, what can we get away with? We're looking at, okay, what offends God and how can we make sure we're as far away from it as possible? So with that information now, we're going to look at the text. First verse, Matthew 5:27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Now in the NASB, what's it mean when it's in capital letters? Old Testament or somewhere else in the New Testament. It means it is quoted scripture. Yeah, so this is from Exodus. It's from Deuteronomy as well. It's the law that God gave people. It's the 7th commandment. God definitely said, you shall not commit adultery. Now, check, we all know what adultery is. In Freiberg's lexicon, the word moikuro means sexual intercourse with someone who is married to another. Okay? Adultery is sexual dealings with someone who is married to another. So it could be a married man having sex with someone else, or it could be someone who's not married having sex with someone who's married. This is what adultery is. So what we see here, straight off the bat, in the Old Testament, God commands us to respect marriage. God commands us to respect marriage. Remember, his moral law, his 10 commandments still stand today. They haven't, it's not like, oh, Jesus died on the cross, 10 commandments don't count. They still stand. We looked at that a couple of weeks ago. So, It's interesting that this part of God's moral law has been severely attacked these days, hasn't it? I mean, TV has seriously attacked it. I mean, a lot of films now, they actually glorify adultery. And the hero is normally the man or the woman who's unhappy at home in their marriage, and so now they go and have a little affair. And by the end of the film, they twist your mind into thinking, yeah, I hope they manage to have a happy life together. And you know, God's saying, no, that's not what I planned for marriage. That's not the plan. If you look at the law now, law's made it so that being married doesn't have any advantage over just being a boyfriend and girlfriend living together. You know, they just keep making more and more benefits for people who aren't married. Now they do the same thing for homosexual couples. So what's happened, the law in England has blatantly gone against God's moral law. So it's very sad. The application is, let's not let our minds get twisted by what's happening around us. Because a lot of people now, Christian authors, are writing books saying, well, do you know what? It don't really matter about being married. As long as you love someone, you can live with them. And there's even some so-called Christians trying to say, and if you're homosexual, you can live together, and that's the same as marriage. And that's not what we find out in the Ten Commandments. So, what is a legalistic approach to this commandment? Anyone, any ideas? This commandment of don't commit adultery. If you was a Pharisee and you're trying to draw a line and find out how close you could get to the line, how do you think you would approach adultery?
Well, you think about it.
Thinking about it, as long as you think about it, but don't do it, then you're okay. You know, just don't do the deed. You hear a lot of people say, it's all right to look, just don't touch. A lot of wives say that to their husbands. It's all right to look, just don't touch. I heard a story of a woman who was shopping with her husband, and she had her head down and looking through all the clothes. The husband standing there. Some woman walked in, dressed up nice and fancy, good-looking woman, and the husband looks at her, watches her walk all across the store, and his wife, without even looking up, said, was it worth all the trouble that you're in now? Which is good, because too many people these days say, you can look but don't touch. That is a Pharisaic, a legalistic approach to this commandment, saying, well, as long as I don't actually do the deed of adultery, then I'm okay. Now, I was in a small group meeting years ago. We're having this small group meeting. This is Christians meeting in the midweek. And a boyfriend and girlfriend just say in a small group, oh yeah, we share a bed together, but nothing ever happens. Now, I was shocked, but you know what I was really shocked by? That no one batted an eyelid. And everyone was just like, yeah, that's cool. And I was saying, do you think that's really wise? And they were like, oh yeah, nothing ever happens. Now, the thing is, we all know that something is going to happen eventually. But even if nothing ever happened, that's a legalistic approach to adultery. People don't realize it. They think this is showing their freedom in Christ. It's not. It's legalism. It's saying, well, as long as we don't get on top of one another and start making babies, then we're okay. Whereas the real approach is to say, what offends God? How do we get as far away from that as possible? Let's not even be in the same bed. That would be the best approach to it. So, and that is what Jesus shows us now. Next verse, verse 28. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And what Jesus is showing us here is that adultery starts with sexual interest in someone. It's kind of scary. Adultery starts with sexual interest in someone. Jesus is showing them that their line that they've drawn is in the wrong place. They've drawn it at actually getting into bed with one another, making babies. He's saying, no, the line is when you look at them and you desire them. Now, when it says looks at a woman with lust, it's not as clear in the English as it is in the Greek. In the Greek, it blatantly says looks with the purpose of lust. Okay, I just want to make that clear. It's looking with the purpose of lust. So the word epithumeo means to have sexual interest in someone. And what it means here is looking at someone with the purpose, with the intention of having sexual interest in them. So I think it's important to get that, because some people could feel really bad if someone walks past and their eye turns for a split second. Now, if your eye turns for a split second and then you're like, I'm not going to look at that, that is a good thing. But if you then say, and you look at them with the intention of lusting, with the intention of having sexual interest, or if you do that in your mind as well, Jesus is saying you've already committed adultery in your heart. So I thought it's quite important to make that clear. Now, at the same time as making that clear, it's also important to know that we don't want to be Pharisees, and we don't want to try and set up our own little lines and say, okay, so I could maybe look at a girl for half a second, and then if it hasn't reached that point where I've got the intent of looking at her, like if it's just accidentally, then I'm okay. I'd say that's a dangerous way to start looking at things. That's what the Pharisees are doing, drawing a line and seeing how close can we get to the line. So instead, it's just better to be like, hey, I'm not going to look. Even if someone catches my eye, I'm going to quickly look away. That kind of thing. But I thought it was worth pointing out that the Greek does clearly say looking with the intention of lust. Anyone remember what the word for heart is? Greek word cardia. Bauer says it's the center and source of the whole inner life, with its thinking, feeling, and volition. Anyone remember what volition means? Your will. When you want to do things, okay? So what he's saying with it, there's three things there, thinking, feeling, and volition. Jesus is saying, when you look at someone with sexual interest, you've already thought about adultery. That's the first thing. You've thought about it. Next one is feeling. You've already felt it in an emotional sense. You've felt that feeling of adultery. And thirdly, volition. You've already wanted to do it. That's why Jesus is saying, oi everyone, you've done it in your hearts already. You've already thought about it, you've felt it, and you've wanted to do it. So, as soon as you get an idea in your head, throw it out. Sometimes it might not even be a sexual idea. You know, it seems that a lot of people who are married that fall into adultery, it happens in the workplace where their young secretary seems more fun and exciting. She doesn't have piles of washing to do and babies to feed. And the boss is thinking, she's kind of nice, she always smells nice, she's always really polite to me. And he starts thinking these things in his head. Then he starts thinking, I wonder what would happen if one day I ended up with her. And he lets these things run away in his mind. And what always happens is he ends up with her. Then he leaves his wife. And what happens? A year later, he's looking at his secretary and she's like, man, she's like always carrying washing around. She's like got curlers in her hair. She don't always put on makeup like she used to. And he's back to the same situation because the devil has tricked him. It all started with him thinking about it in his mind. Now, Jesus, fortunately, gives us practical advice on this. Matthew 5:29. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. It's pretty deep. We have some machetes at the back. Only joking. People start running out the doors. That was a joke. Okay. But I was chatting to someone the other day who actually was saying how in some countries that is done. Not Christian countries, but, well, not Christians that do it in those countries. Now, when it says make you stumble, that means causes you to sin, okay? It's not talking about literally falling over. It's talking about something that causes you to sin. Now, it's important to know this isn't literal. It's important to not go home and cut your right arm off or take your right eye out, okay? Here's my reasons for believing this. One, I personally don't believe that we have our body parts when we're in heaven, okay? I believe that if you go to heaven now, your soul goes to heaven, but your body doesn't. Then at the resurrection, you'll be given your resurrected body. So that's one of the reasons why I don't believe that this is literal. The other reason is, if you take your right eye out, can you still look at a girl with your left eye? No. I think you can. I can look at all of you in here right now. So even if I take my right eye out, I'm still able to look. Okay, some people think the body parts talked about here are related to sex. I don't believe they are. Later, in another passage, Jesus talks about if your leg causes you to sin, cut off. I don't think your leg is directly related to lust. okay? Maybe other people's, but not your own leg. So this is not literal, okay? So don't go home chopping any bits off. Now, according to a scholar called Wallace, in his exegetical syntax of the New Testament, the Pharisees actually believed that parts of your body cause you to sin. Okay, they would be like, well, my arm causes me to sin, or my leg causes me to sin. See, these guys have got it locked. They got it down, this whole system of being able to break whatever laws you want and not really be guilty. Because it's their body parts that cause them to sin. Now, what Wallace says is that when you look at this, and for those of you who do the Greek course, the if there is a first-class condition. Okay, so Jesus is saying if, and let's say for the sake of argument this is true. So what Wallace says is Jesus being provocative here. He's saying to the Pharisees, if your arm really does cause you to sin, if it really is your arm's fault, then why not chop it off? Because it's better to go into heaven and be called lefty than to end up going to hell. That's like what Jesus is saying. He's saying if it really is something else's fault, then chop it off. And this is interesting because the same thinking applies today. Everyone's got a reason why they committed adultery. There's always a reason. Someone might be like, well, I was lonely and he showed me love. Or it might be like, well, love, I was drunk. So it weren't really me, you see. It was a Jack Daniels, yeah? That kind of thing. Everyone's always got a reason. And Jesus is saying, okay, if you've got those reasons, why not chop them off? Get rid of them. Because we know from what we've been studying the last few weeks, it's all about the heart anyway. But Jesus is saying, get rid of those other things. Let's just get back to the heart. Deal with the heart. Any of those things that cause you to stumble, chop them off. So, here's an example of one thing you can chop off. The internet. Many psychologists are now saying there's been a tremendous increase in what they call sex addictions. And they say it's due to the internet. Now, what Jesus would say to someone who struggles with the internet is, chop it off. Get rid of it. Don't blame the internet, just disconnect it. Now, there's some people that need email, and I know some people, they have email, but they don't have an internet browser, so they can't surf the net. There's also software called Covenant Eyes, from covenanteyes.com. I have it on my computer. Everything I look at on the internet, a copy, it gets monitored and it gets sent to a friend of mine, gets sent to another pastor, and he can see everything I've looked at on the net. Comes from the verse in Job where Job says, I've made a covenant with my eyes not to look at a younger woman. So there's loads of things you can do so that the internet don't stumble you. If you don't have a filter on the internet, I'd suggest it's a bit like having the Playboy channel on your TV and just saying, well, I'll never switch it on. You know, it's very, very risky. Or it'd be like having dynamite in your house with one of these big detonators that you push down and just putting it there in the middle of the living room and being like, yeah, we got the detonator, but we don't ever push it down. You know, just get rid of the detonator. The other one is TV. And a lot of people say, you know, I'm struggling with Channel 5 movies on TV. Well, you can detune Channel 5 very easily. Some people say, well, I don't want to get rid of the TV because it's just too convenient. I want to have the TV. Well, Jesus is saying, having your right eye is convenient, but pluck it out if it causes you to sin. So you don't want to end up missing out on your blessings in heaven because you were too into having TV. Now let's look at the next verse, verse 30. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you, for it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, what is the repeated phrase here? Say it again. I'm not understanding anyone. If, okay, yeah, if, and what's like a key word there that you'd put a circle around? Stumble. Good, yeah. If you were studying this at home, you'd be like, hang on a minute, I've seen that word stumble the second time, and I don't see that word too often in the New Testament. So you've got a clue here. There's something to look at here. Now, what Jesus is showing us here is that lust is a trap. Lust is a trap. Quite literally, this word causes you to stumble. It's the verb scandalizo, and it's from the noun scandalon. Now, what does that sound like, scandalon? Scandal, that's right, yeah. Now, check it out, right? In the Low-Nida dictionary, it says for this Greek word that it's a trap, probably of the type which has a stick which when touched by an animal causes the trap to shut. You all got that? Someone sets up a trap in the woods. There's this like little kind of sort of cave type thing with a stick. The animal crawls in because he sees some food, nice, nuts or a bit of cheese. Walks in, taps a little stick and bang! Suddenly he's trapped and he waits for the hunter to come and eat him. This is the noun from the verb that Jesus is using. It's quite deep. So when he says something that causes you to sin, he's saying something that is a trap. He's showing us lust is a trap. Now, it's never sold to us that way. Just like the car salesman never says, yeah, this is a rust bucket, it's going to last you 2 weeks. He says, this is your car, mate. You have this, all the girls will like you. This is the one for you. Oh, yeah, love, this car, this is great. I did it right. For a girl like you, mate, you look proper sexy. That kind of thing. That's the way the devil's playing it with lust. He's trying to make it seem good to us, and you think, yes, 15 minutes of fun. Where Satan's really thinking, but it's a trap, and I'm going to try and get you for your whole life. Now, this is the noun, scandalon. The verb, scandalizo, according to Freiberg, means to cause to do wrong or sin. Check out the next bit. To fall away, and check out the third one. To give up believing. I don't think that when the devil sets up little traps for us, that he just wants us to commit adultery. I think ultimately he wants us to give up believing. That is the ultimate trap. When you look at the consequences of adultery, they're huge. You've got fatherless children. You can lose your faith yourself. There's people who've done that. They're just like, they love committing adultery so much, they just say, well, I'm not going to follow Jesus now. I don't want to be a hypocrite. And they leave Jesus. Very bad move. Who else can lose their faith? If a man commits adultery against his wife, who else do you think might lose their faith? The wife and the woman he's done it with. Be like, you're a Christian and you do this. What about his neighbours? What are they going to think? His children. Everyone's going to look and say, this guy was a Christian and he committed adultery. And it's going to cause people to give up believing or to not believe in the first place. So this is a devil's trap. It's important to know that God's law is actually beneficial to us. The moral law isn't just to make God happy, it's also beneficial for us. So when we don't commit adultery, the quality of our lives will be better. I saw a statistic that said that, I think it was 66% of couples, married couples that have problems, when they decided to stick with it, they were much happier afterwards, and they were glad they stuck with it. The other people just give up. The majority of people are happier when they decide to stick with it and work through their problems. So, next time you find yourself getting trapped, that you're thinking, it'd be nice to hook up with them, or you start thinking, I wonder what if this happened and that happened, and then I could get together with them, those kind of things. Or, my husband doesn't really seem this, or my wife doesn't really seem too much like that. Remember, that's a trap. It's a trap, and it's ultimately to cause you to give up believing so that you go to hell. Now, if you've already fallen into the trap, and if you fall into it every day, remember, King David done the same thing. Okay? King David did the same thing, and if you do what he did, you admit your sins to God, confess your sins to God, then he will forgive you and cleanse you from all unrighteousness. 1 John 1, verse 9. Okay? So I'm not trying to be down on us here. I'm just teaching you what the text says, but remember, God will always forgive us. That's why it's sad that people who decide to just keep on committing adultery, they're not going to ever stop it. God will forgive you. He will restore you. So now we've done that, we're going to see what Jesus says about divorce. Verse 31. It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Now, this is actually translated better by both the NIV and by the Net Bible, where in the Net Bible it says, it was said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a legal document. Okay? In the English language, let him makes it sound like it's, let him do this. Whereas really it's not. It's a command saying must. And this is what the emphasis of what God's saying here. It's not on divorcing, it's on if you divorce, you must give them a legal document saying so. Now, what this shows us, And what we're going to see is divorce was a concession, not a commandment. Okay? Divorce is not a commandment from God. Divorce is a concession. In other words, God allows people or allowed people to get divorces because they were messing up so badly. So he allowed them, but it was a concession. It was not a commandment. Some people took this as him saying, all right, you blokes, all right, you men, if you're not happy with your wife, just kick her out of the house. Some people saw that. They were like, okay, I'm not happy with my wife. She burnt the eggs this morning, so I'm going to give her a certificate of divorce. Now, that is not what he was saying. What he was saying, oi, you men, if you do kick your wife out of the house, you have to give her a written certificate of divorce. And it says that then when she marries someone else, you cannot later, if that man dies, marry her again. It's done. And what he was doing was protecting the women. Back in those days, if you was a woman, you couldn't get a job at Asda or 7-Eleven or at the bank. In Palestine, in Jesus' day, if you're a woman, you're dependent on your husband for financial support. So if you get divorced, if your husband kicks you out of the house, what are you going to do?
Kick her out, innit?
Well, yeah, and if you get kicked out, what are you then going to do?
You ain't gonna get a job, are you?
You're not going to get a job, so what are you going to have to do to get money if you're a woman? You're going to have to get married, find yourself a husband. But if the husband, your previous husband, didn't give you a certificate of divorce, you can't get married. You know, people would just be like, oh, she's a slapper. Instead of, oh, okay, she got divorced. They'd just be like, she's going around all kinds of different people. And this was the way it works. So Jesus is saying, no, you have to give a legal document. So what he's also doing is making the men not just kick women out for any old reason. And that's what happens these days. People divorce for any old reason. And Jesus was trying to make it harder, or God was trying to make it harder, saying you've got to actually write out a proper certificate. Okay? Now, Jesus talked about this later in Matthew 19, 7-8. They said to him, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? He said to them, that's Jesus, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it has not been this way. So we see divorce was not a moral law that God gave them. But because men were just throwing women out of the house however they wanted, and they weren't giving them any legal means that they could then remarry, so you just have these women that are either then going to be sleeping around and get a reputation, or they're just going to be poor and die because they can't feed themselves. He permitted them to divorce their wives. But this was not how it was from the beginning. In the beginning, who did God create? Adam and Eve. He created Adam and Eve was the first married couple. In the beginning there was marriage. God created it. The ones with cancer did not create marriage. God created it. He makes the rules. So it's important to know that when people get into marriage, it's for life, it's permanent. Yeah, it's not. I can't keep up with Hollywood. I don't read magazines and that, so I don't know what's going on. But I always think two people are married because I heard a year ago they were married, and you're chatting to someone, they say, no, she's marrying someone else now. And you're like, right, that was only a year ago that she was married to that other guy. And it's like, well, whose baby is it? Well, it might be him, but, and that's what's going on these days, because people get married with the attitude, if it don't work, we'll bail out. Some people say, give it 2 years, see what happens. That is not what God says, not at all. Now, verse 32. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, which means immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, what we see here is that divorce is a huge cause of adultery. Divorce is a huge cause of adultery. Remember these women, if they're not properly divorced in Palestine, they've got no money, no financial support. They're going to have to remarry. But if they haven't really been divorced from their husband, when they remarry, they're actually committing adultery. So that's important, because these days, like getting back to these Hollywood actors, when they get divorced and marry someone else, in the state's eyes, they're getting remarried. In God's eyes, they're still married to the first person. Everyone see that? God looks at him, he's like, I was there when you made a covenant relationship with this guy, with Brad Pitt. I was there, I saw that covenant relationship being made. That covenant relationship still stands. It don't matter if you manage to get a divorce and remarried. As far as I'm concerned, you're still married. This is very, very important. So it shows us that when marriages aren't working out, people can't just give up and say, well, let's go off and try it with someone else. Because that is committing adultery. The only reason Jesus gives here that you could get divorced is unfaithfulness. And there's a big debate about whether that's talking about unfaithfulness in the betrothal period, in other words, when you're getting engaged, or whether it's talking about unfaithfulness once you're married. Because the Greek word there for immorality is porneia. So it's not actually the same word for adultery. And that's a big debate, and we won't go into that here, because this isn't the main thing that Jesus is talking about in the text. But I just let you know that. The very important application to have is that marriage was created back in the Garden of Eden, and it's sacred. God doesn't want people messing with it. Now, does marriage work? I say yes. A lot of people say marriage doesn't work, and what is the reason people always give for marriages not working? The divorce rate. People say, look how many people get divorced. That shows that marriage doesn't work. Well, that is a ridiculous argument. Okay, that's like saying, look how many car crashes there are, cars don't work. Okay, it doesn't make sense. Marriage is permanent, but marriage works. It's the people doing the marriage that don't work because of their misunderstanding. Here's a kind of crazy example. Imagine someone has an umbrella that works just fine, and one day it's pouring out with rain, and they walk out and they don't put their umbrella up, and they walk for half an hour through the rain, and then they see their mate, and they're really wet, and someone's chatting to them, and there's like, hey, does your umbrella not work? And they're like, nah, it's rubbish, look at me, I'm soaked. Now, you're not going to say back to them, yeah, you're right, umbrellas don't work. You're going to look at them and say, bruv, you don't work. There's something wrong here. You know, the umbrella is fine, marriage is fine, marriage is permanent, God created it, there's nothing wrong with marriage. What's wrong is with our ideas of marriage. We're conditioned by TV and everything around us to think when marriage is difficult, we can bail out. And that is the problem. Not the marriage, but that we think we can bail out. God designed it. It's great. There can be difficulties in marriage. Everyone who's married admits that. There's difficulties, but there's other solutions to divorce. Divorce is not a biblical solution. So to sum all this up, go right back to the beginning. The first thing I said, I was talking about a word beginning with L. Anyone remember what it was? Legalism. That's it. Now, anyone remember how legalism works?
Draw a line and get as close as possible.
There you go. Good. Legalism draws a line and then tries to get as close as possible to the line. Let's be careful that we don't do that, okay? Some of you maybe will be itching to come up to me afterwards and say, okay, but bottom line, Duncan, what can I do? When I go clubbing next weekend, what can I do? And that's not what this is saying. Now, instead, what we have to do is find out what's offensive to God and stay as far as possible away from it. So we know God don't like adultery, you don't like divorce. Let's stay far away from it as possible. Don't even entertain the idea of divorce. Don't even entertain the idea of, maybe I could end up with them. They seem nicer than my wife. He seems much more gentle than my husband. That kind of thing. Don't even entertain that thinking. When you get boyfriends and girlfriends, don't try and see what the most is you can get away with, how far you can go. Sadly, there's been a lot of books written by Christian authors saying, well, you're allowed to touch this part of the body and that part of the body, but you can't touch this and that. That's legalism. What Jesus would say is stay as far away as possible from everything until you get married. Now, the next thing is remove all traps from your life. Remember that word, scandalon. It's a trap. The animal touches it, and then the trap falls down on him. Remove all traps. Internet, TV, could be flirting with someone in the office. you know, or someone at the checkout in Sainsbury's. You know, you keep bumping into them. Bear in mind, this could be a trap, okay? Give yourselves parameters in your life that you're not going to step over. Third thing, work on your heart. Remember, it all starts in your heart. That's where adultery starts, in your heart. And that's why the first things we studied at the beginning of Matthew chapter 5 are so important, about how we deal with sin, our attitude to sin, having a clean heart. This is where it all starts. Matthew 15:19 says, "For out of the heart come evil ideas, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander." So where does sexual immorality come from? The heart. That's right. It doesn't actually come from the internet or the TV. It comes from the heart. But Jesus says, if you're going to blame those things, then cut them off. Let's get back to basics and deal with your heart. We all need to deal with our hearts. King David committed adultery so badly that he had the woman's wife killed. Sorry. It's the effects of living in a postmodern culture. He had a husband killed. Glad you're all awake still. And after the prophet came to him and said, and when I say the prophet, I'm talking about Nathan, all right? Okay, some other dodgy geezer beginning with M. Right, when Nathan came to him and confronted him about his sin, because David was kind of trying to hide it for a while, in Psalm 51:10, this is what David prayed. "Create in me a clean heart, O God, renew a loyal spirit within me." That's from the NLT. "Create in me a clean heart, O God, renew a loyal spirit within me." So that should be all of our prayers each day. In the morning, pray that God will be Lord over our eyes, over our minds. Pray that He'd be Lord over our eyes and our minds. Pray that He would create a clean heart in us and renew a loyal spirit, like the first day we got saved, that we would be faithful to God and that we'd be faithful to our husband, our wife, or our future husband and wife. So let's do that and stay as far away as possible from adultery.